Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of KIS Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of organic growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday, and I'm excited to be back making podcasts for 2018. We have a great lineup of guests for future interviews, ranging from the latest in lighting technology to soil testing, permaculture, lean farming, outdoor cultivation, and much more. This podcast, though, is about a subject that many people probably don't give a lot of thought to, but it's an important aspect of cultivation. Here with me today is William Evans. I met William actually through Suzanne Wainwright Evans, the entomologist from my last podcast. When we were talking off air, she said, "You have to meet my husband," and we started talking about what he does, and it seemed like a perfect fit for the podcast. William has been working in the horticulture and nursery industry for over 20 years and brings a wealth of experience to the table. This podcast is not the most glamorous of subjects, but one that deserves some attention. Today's podcast is all about containers. While I've been a proponent of planting directly into the ground when possible, this is not an option in many situations, and propagation is best done in small trays or containers. William will share with us how containers can dramatically reduce transplant shock, improve worker efficiency, increase plant health, and a myriad of other benefits. We also talk about how the wrong container can cause major issues resulting in poor growth, root girdling, and even the potential for your container being a source of contamination. Without further ado, though, here's our interview.
Okay, hello, Ted.
Hi, thanks for taking the time to do this today. I really appreciate it. So I wanted to talk to you today about these fertile pots.
Sure.
Can you give me a little bit of background into how you came across the product and your history with it, and then a little more about how it's made?
My personal history with it was that I was working for a distributor that was selling them in Pennsylvania a long time ago, in another lifetime it seems. Fertile is a French company that's been manufacturing these pots since 1960. So it's over 50 years now. They've always been manufactured on the east side of France. The reason that the factory is there is because they're made primarily of spruce fibers, and the forests in the area there have a lot of spruce. And so the factory is competing with companies that are making firewood and timber and pulp paper and things like that. And they buy the firewood, or they buy the logs from the local woodcutters, and then process them there and make them into pots.
So these pots are made of spruce. Are there any other ingredients in the containers themselves?
There is a little bit of peat, about 20% or so. It fluctuates a little bit there. And there's 3 to 4% limestone that's in there to buffer the pH of the pots. There is a new version of these that's being introduced, which is a peat-free pot, which is 100% wood fibers. There's a couple different blends of wood fiber, but again, it's primarily spruce fiber, and there's some maritime pine in there as well. But then again, it's all wood fibers. That's the main thing. So it's probably easier to refer to them as a wood fiber pot.
And these pots are 100% biodegradable.
Absolutely, yeah. There's nothing synthetic in there whatsoever.
And they're approved for use in organic production too, I believe?
Yes, both versions are OMRI listed, the Organic Materials Review Institute that's in Eugene, Oregon. They put you through a pretty rigorous process of examining where your raw materials come from, how they're sourced, how you process them, etc., in order to be able to get an OMRI listing, which OMRI listings will certify that you are approved for use in the National Organic Program run by the USDA. It doesn't necessarily mean that your product is organic. It means that your product is approved for use in organics. There's a big distinction between an input and an output as far as the USDA is concerned. Fertile pot would be considered an input, and it must be approved for use in organics. The only thing that can be outputs are actually something that is grown or produced from plant or animals.
Yes, so our soil, for example, I'm working on getting it approved for use in organic production. It can't actually be certified organic for the reasons that you're saying. It's a sort of a bureaucratic labeling issue there.
Correct, but it has to be approved for use in organics. So you have to go through the whole process. I'm sure you're dealing with that now.
Yes. So before we get into some of the differences between fertile pots and some of these other types of containers, can we talk a little bit about what the main benefits are?
Well, the main benefit to fertile pot is really the porosity of the wall of the container. And to try to help you understand why that's important, is that when you plant something in this pot, whether you put it in from a plug or you put it in from a seed or a cutting, however you start, When the roots go through the soil that's in the pot and they reach the edge of the pot, because the wall of the pot is about 85% porous, the roots are going to pass straight through straight away. The pot wall is so porous that we don't even put drain holes in the pots. We don't cut drain holes into the pots because we don't need them. And why that's important is because it's going to develop a natural root structure that is going to allow the roots to develop as if they were in the native soil. The advantage to them going through the pot is that as they penetrate the pot and they encounter air, you're going to get root pruning. And so the air is basically stunting the apical dominance, or the desire of the root to grow forward, and preventing it from growing forward. The root naturally forces lateral branching. So just like if you say you had a basil plant and you pinch the top of the basil plant, you're stunting the apical dominance of that basil plant there, and the result of it is it branches out. So you get a bushier basil plant. The same thing happens with the root structure. So as the roots are penetrating the wall of the pot, air is doing the pruning. It's basically stunting the apical dominance, and it's forcing the roots to branch out. And remember, the tip of the root is the only point that actually does any work on a plant. It's where the nutrients are uptake and the moisture is uptaken. So if you have more root tips as in response to the pruning process, you have two things with a fertile pot. You have a natural structure because it's not being containerized. It's not turning inside a plastic wall. And then you have an enhanced natural root structure because of the pruning process. So you have a better ability of that plant to uptake nutrients and moisture. And when you take that pot and you put it into the next larger container or into the native landscape as you're transplanting it, all of the apical dominance that's on the outside of that, on those roots that were on the outside of the pot, will return, and the plant will grow faster into that next larger container or into the native landscape because of the fact of the type of root structure that it's got behind it.
So we see a lot of photos online or in forums, and you see people with showing off the roots of their plants, and the roots are starting to wrap around the inside of a traditional container. And what essentially you're talking about here is by having that root stop growing and starting a new tip, we're actually increasing the fertility of that plant, or its ability to take up nutrients.
Correct. You're increasing the ability for it to uptake nutrients and moisture. A lot of these photos that you see where they show, just massive amounts of roots wrapping around, that's actually really a bad thing, because two things. One is that the energy of the plant is being forced into apically dominant roots, which really, again, the tip of the root's the only important point of this. So you have all the rest of the roots just carrying the nutrients and moisture up to the plant. So if you've got them wrapped around, if they're encountering a solid wall, if they're encountering a plastic wall or a pot that needs drain holes cut into it, they're going to turn and they're going to circle, and that's going to set up a pattern that's very difficult for the plant to break out of when you put it into the next larger container. That's why oftentimes you'll get directions when you get a plastic pot. They'll say, well, pull it out of the plastic pot and take a knife and score the roots. And the reason that you're trying to score the roots is you're trying to break that containerized structure that's been set up by the plastic pot. So, of course, you realize that's damage to the root structure. That's setting the plant back. You're going to get transplant shock. In other words, the plant's going to survive when you plant it, but it's not going to thrive because the roots have to regenerate and form into something that can be used by the plant again. So, yeah, apically dominant roots are really a bad thing, and a lot of people get them confused with, good root structure.
Yeah, growing up with my parents owning a retail nursery, 20 years ago, he was teaching me how to transplant a plant, and that process involved essentially taking a root-bound plant and really ripping the roots apart very aggressively with a knife, with your fingers, and
yes.
If you didn't do that, that plant would stay in the shape of that pot. Like if I took a traditional plastic plant grown in a plastic container and didn't break up those roots that were root bound and planted that plant, it would eventually die anyway, because the roots aren't able to break out of that shape and actually reach out into the other, the natural soil or native soil.
In extreme conditions, it's called root girdling, where the roots that have set up in this containerized structure, as they grow and they get bigger, they get fatter and fatter, and eventually they actually choke each other off. So that it's like a chokehold that's created by the plant on itself due to the shape of the root structure that you put into the ground. That's why, your dad would tell you to, tear the bottom of it and pull these roots apart. But I mean, you can imagine how much stress that is on the plant. Wouldn't it be nicer to just take the entire good root structure with a natural root structure, enhanced natural root structure, and put it right into the next container and let it continue growing? The plant doesn't even know that it's been transplanted because it really hasn't been, quote unquote transplanted. It's just been given a little more room to grow now.
Yeah, so when I first heard about root pruning or air pruning, as I've also heard it called, was through smart pots or fabric containers. And so we started using fabric containers, only selling fabric containers in our garden center. But they felt like an incomplete solution to me for a few reasons. One of them being is that they're very challenging to transplant out of. Trying to peel back the fabric, if you've ever done it, it's a real pain. And trying to pull the plant out, it's a lot of labor. I love the idea of being able to just transplant the plant right into the ground and not have to worry about that container. Knowing it's going to break down was wonderful.
Yeah, if you're pulling a plant out of a plastic pot or peeling back a fabric wrapper, you're breaking the little tips that are always at the edge there, at the very end of the plant. And that's going to cause transplant shock. But I mean, of course, with something that doesn't biodegrade, you have to remove that because otherwise it'll stay there forever and ever and ever. With the fertile pot, you're just planting it in the ground, giving it a little more room to grow, and there is no transplant shock. As far as labor goes in doing that, one of our biggest markets is actually landscape companies that are installing large plantings. And there's generally about a 30% labor savings in terms of the labor costs of installing using fertile pot versus something that's coming out of a plastic pot or a pot that you're going to have to manipulate in some way before you can put it into the ground, because you're just putting the pot right into the ground, put the soil on it, and move on. There's no removing the pot. There's no cleaning up at the end of the day. There's no going to the dump at the end of the day and dropping off thousands and thousands of plastic pots. So just from a labor perspective, there's an advantage there.
Well, I think another big advantage too is the amount of education it requires to plant a plant or properly transplant. I've spent a lot of time teaching staff how I want our plants transplanted around the nursery, and that would involve breaking up the roots and going through that whole process, not having the plant out of the container before it's in the soil for very long, and being able to transplant with a biodegradable pot where it doesn't have to necessarily be the optimal transplant time. If the plant hasn't filled that container, I'm not having to worry about removing it and having all the soil fall apart because there's not enough root structure. And I don't also, on the same note, have to worry about it being root bound when I go to transplant it, and like you mentioned, having to break apart those roots. So I love this idea.
Yeah, the root pruning will allow you to a bigger window of opportunity in terms of when you actually have to transplant, because you're not going to get that, as you said, container-bound plant. One thing that you do need to be aware of when you plant a fertile pot, generally with any plant, you want to plant at the same grade. You don't want to bury the plant. You don't want to leave it, raised up really high. So over time, what can happen with a fertile pot, if you've filled it up with soil, you planted in there, and you've grown in, and the soil may have compacted over the growing time, so you end up with a lip that's sticking up. You don't want to plant that so deep that the lip is completely buried. You're going to want to plant it at grade and then just simply tear off the lip, because remember, the fertile pot's going to be very soft at this point. You almost have to consider it really more of a future root ball that's not it's not necessarily a plant. You're going to have to handle it a little bit differently. So grabbing it by the lip, you might tear that lip off because it's very soft. Whereas if you picked it up like a glass of water, it's very easy to move around. But these are some of the considerations that you'll have to be aware of when using fertile pot versus, say, a plastic pot.
So let's talk about some of these differences here. Now, like I said, I was familiar with fabric pots prior to learning about these fertile pots. And some of the challenges I found was I have an actual article on my blog about some independent testing that was shared with me regarding the heavy metal content of some of these fabric pots coming out of China. I do worry about even with these, I haven't seen anything on molded plastic pots, but I do worry about people growing edible crops in some of these potential containers, because, you're growing out in the summer in 90-degree temperature. If those pots have BPA or other things that can break down at high temperatures, I do worry about that. So that would be one thing to be concerned about with fabric or plastic pots. Another potential issue there is root temperature. I assume the fertile pot would be better at reducing the heat compared to a black plastic pot on a hot summer day, or is that a factor?
Well, it's a double-edged sword. It will be better at reducing the temperatures. However, it's also going to dry out a lot faster than a plastic pot. Because remember, the entire pot, you have to think of this as a future root ball. You're dealing with a way of holding soil in shape while the plants develop. The roots penetrate the pot. The plant and the pot become one. And there is no way to remove the pot at that point, but it's also going to transevaporate across the entire surface of the pot. So while it works well, say in sub-irrigation systems where you put the pot in a a small low bath of water and it'll wick up like a sponge, the opposite is also true. So you do have to be careful about keeping the pots moist. And you don't want to let them just sit in the hot sun and bake. Just like your dad told you, don't let the pots, when you pull a plant out of a plastic pot, don't sit it out in the sun for a couple hours before you plant it. You have to consider the fertile pot as something that's been, out of the pot, if you will.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I don't always think about that, but yeah, I did notice with my fabric pots, I do have to water more frequently than in plastic containers.
Yeah, well, I would give you the pluses and the minuses. I mean, there's, advantages and disadvantages to every system.
Yeah, so another thing regarding these fertile pots is you do have the environmental impact of shipping them, the fossil fuel cost of getting them here from France.
True.
Relatively speaking, I still think that environmental impact is going to be less than that of a fabric container or especially a plastic container. I mean, right now at my nursery, I have these giant 1 and 2 yard totes that are just full of old containers that people drop them off at our nursery all the time, and so no one wants them because a lot of commercial operations won't reuse containers because of the potential for pathogens and disease.
Sure.
And the cost and labor to sanitize these containers is not worth it. So I'm excited to stop having to take these containers in and store them on my property, and then potentially also have to take them to the dump and add more plastic back into our environment. So in that regard, I think they still have less of an environmental impact, even though they are coming all the way from France.
Well, I can give you a couple of little points that, well, first of all, the majority of the shipping is on water, which is a relatively low carbon impact in terms of, pounds of carbon per mile, if you will, compared to, say, trucking, which is very high. But one of the neat things about the way Fertil produces these pots is that they use hydroelectric energy that's produced from the creek, from the stream that is next to them. There's 3 generating stations, so all of the electricity that's used in the process is completely renewable. The forests that they harvest the trees from are non-GMO. GMO is not permitted in France, period. There's no clear cutting permitted. They must plant with, at least I think it's 5 or 6 species of trees. I might be a little off on the numbers there, but it's quite a few. And they're not allowed to use heavy machinery in there. So it's really a very different way of foresting than, say, in the United States, where you have just massive tracts of land that are clear cut. You won't see that at all in France. They've been actively managing this forest that the wood is cut from for over 400 years. A long time ago, they cut down everything. They made a big mistake, and then the king of France decreed that there's going to be no more of this, and so that's why you don't see this kind of clear cut and slash logging in Europe.
That's great. That's great to hear. So, changing directions a little bit here, you had mentioned that you can get some mold on these containers.
Yep.
Over time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Basically, what what we're talking about is saprophytes. Saprophytes are an opportunistic fungus that will feed on dead and decaying material. The fertile pot itself is sterile when it's produced because the temperatures that the pot is basically baked. It's almost like making paper mache, where the wood is ground up, it's put into a slurry. There's a screen or a sieve that dips into that. A vacuum is formed. It draws the enough wood up onto the screen. That screen goes into an oven for about 45 to 50 minutes, where it's almost 300 and something degrees. I mean, nothing can live through that. There are no pathogens at all alive on the plants or on the pots when they're delivered to you. However, in your greenhouse, you might have saprophytes. Well, it's likely you have saprophytes floating around. It's a natural part of the soil. It actually makes healthy soil to have saprophytes in there. So if somebody says, well, I'm getting mold on my pots, and your pots are causing a problem here, it's not the pots that are the problem. It's really dirty greenhouses that are causing the problem. People don't like to hear that, but usually the answer that I give to them, I say, do you still have some in the box? I say, well, yes, I do. Well, take some, bring them home, put them on your shelf in the kitchen, and grow some there, and tell me if you get the same fungus. And the answer is almost every single time, no, I don't get the same fungus. And it's a matter of sanitation in the greenhouse as far as the saprophytes. Now, the saprophytes are not a bad thing. They're actually a good thing for soil health. However, they are unsightly, and for people who are trying to grow a commercial product, that can be a problem. So the pot will support life because it is biodegradable. That's the definition of biodegradable. It must be able to support life. And if you've got a saprophyte floating around in the greenhouse, it's possible that you can get mold or fungus growing on there, and sanitation is the key to solving that problem.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize that not all microbes are bad, and that
no, they're actually good. I mean, a lot of them are very good. That's a part of a natural, healthy soil structure is to have mold and fungus in there that are creating a vibrant ecosystem.
Yeah. Now, when I first found out about this, I was super excited, and I thought my natural progression would be like a 2 by 2 inch cube, or maybe starting in a 4 inch with our veggie starts, and then going into like possibly a 1 gallon, and then up to a 5 gallon, and then we started talking a little bit more, and you made it clear to me that these pots only go up to a certain size for a reason, and when I started thinking about it, it made sense because they do biodegrade. We can't have mother plants or larger plants. So what's the largest size that's really feasible with a fertile pot?
The largest size that's really feasible with a fertile pot is about a 5-inch round pot. We do actually make one that's a little bit bigger than that, but it's very difficult to manage because the weight of the wet soil in there compared to the volume of the pot, or to the surface area of the pot, it's so heavy that it's very difficult to move them around without breaking them quickly and then becoming a problem. So realistically, about a 5-inch pot is about the largest size that you're going to want to do. One of the interesting things, one of our biggest markets is grape production for wine grapes. And many, many years ago, everyone thought, well, we want a bigger pot for a better plant. And we actually have a pot that is about 4 inches in square and about maybe 7 or 8 inches tall. And that was the standard for a lot of grape plants for a long time. And then somebody decided, well, you've got a pot that's a little bit smaller than that. It's about maybe 3 inches wide and about 4 inches tall. And they started using them, and they realized that they were able to get a lot more plants in the greenhouse. And because of the type of root structure, remember we're setting up the natural root structure with the enhanced air pruning that's going on, they were actually able to get to fruiting and flowering in the same amount of time that they were with the larger pot going into the field before that. So suddenly these guys all switched to it's a 7 by 9 centimeter pot. That became the standard for a long time. And then somebody got the great idea, let me look at your pot that's even a little bit smaller than that. And right now the main standard for the grape industry is a 5 centimeter by 9 centimeter pot, which is about 2 inches or so by about 3.5 inches deep. And they've been able to put many more pots into the greenhouse and be able to get to a fruit production in the field in the same amount of time, but increase their output tremendously.
That's great. So a larger container is not necessarily going to be more beneficial. Now, that doesn't
in some cases it can be a problem. Because if you've got when you're transplanting, if you're going into if you're transplanting into the soil, let's say, and you're going into less than desirable soil conditions, if you have a very large pot and you put that into the hole, and you're going from a really nice peat moss mix or what other substrate you're using, the roots tend to not want to explore into less than desirable soil conditions out there. So this is why having the smaller pot forces the roots out, and especially if you've got the fertile pot where the roots are on the outside of the pot and they're in contact, they generally tend to explore into that surrounding soil a lot faster than something that's got a lot more soil that it can use up in a really comfortable space.
So the smaller pot doesn't take into account the fertility system involved or the fertigation going on. So I would assume in the smaller container you're probably fertilizing a little more frequently for these grape growers because there's less fertilizer in the soil because you're using less media.
Well, there's the same amount of fertility needed per cubic inch of plant material. I don't think you're necessarily increasing your rates. You're going to be maybe applying a little bit more frequently because you have less soil that holds the moisture. And if you're liquid irrigating or liquid feeding, you might be using a little more in terms of the amount of time, the number of cycles that you're doing there. But the fertility should be about the same between a larger plant and a smaller plant in terms of the amount of fertilizer that you're going to need.
Okay, but you're able to reduce the size of the container relative to...
Reduce the size of the container, increase the output of your greenhouse per square foot. Because remember, the greenhouse has an overhead cost. There's, it costs so many dollars per square foot to run that place, whether you have, one plant in there or 10,000 plants in there. So when you can divide the overhead operating costs across more plants, you're going to be more profitable.
Sure, and I think this is even more of an issue with cannabis because a lot of them are using artificial lighting, which costs even more money from an electrical perspective and energy perspective. So being able to create that canopy with less square footage, I think is a great option.
For sure. Now the question is going to be, can you get to fruiting and flowering with the grapes is what I'm familiar with, and I can't speak to cannabis with any degree of expertise, but it's going to be a question of, do you get to flowering in the same amount of time where you can actually harvest with more plants? That's really the question.
Yeah, and one thing you mentioned too was going from different types of media where you have a really good potting soil inside your container, and then that exterior soil is not of the same quality, and the roots won't want to push out. We do see that in a traditional landscape because we're taking fruit trees, for example, and that are grown in really good soil that we're then putting out into a ground where we don't always know the fertility or the quality of the soil that the homeowner has. Now, for cannabis, most people are going from potting soil to potting soil, where there's not that difference, so it's not so much of an issue.
Yeah.
But if in a situation, say you had an outdoor greenhouse where the soil quality was not quite the same as the potting soil, then I could see where this container size might come into play. Or what we like to do is take some good compost or a portion of that potting soil and mix it in with the native soils around, I guess in this case it would probably be around your container, but in general we would do it around in the hole. We dig the hole twice the size of our root ball and then mix that in so that the roots will want to reach out past that original shape they were in.
Right. And this is why it's important to have the roots on the outside of the pot, like you do with the fertile pot, so they're already in contact with that right away, and they don't want to just stay in this nice little home that they've got right there. One of the things that we're finding in terms of transplanting there is the guys who are doing sun-grown hemp production seem to be experiencing some success with the fertile pots because they're going into the soil outside. You're going into another larger pot with really nice compost in there. Might not make as much of a difference there.
Yeah, so in general, we're using this to put it in terms that most growers are used to, is we would use them for our seed trays, for maybe a traditional 4-inch container, and then up to about a 1 gallon or a number one sized container, or is sort of the largest size fertile pot. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're really a propagation company. It's when the 5 inches, the largest, are 12 centimeters, the largest that we can do right now that's realistically feasible. We're not somebody who's going to be providing you with 3 and 5 and 15 and 25 gallon containers. After that, it's not possible with a biodegradable container like that. And we're really meant for getting it started in the greenhouse, going from a seed or a cutting. And this is another thing that I kind of wanted to bring up is, we are propagation, and we can produce a tremendous root structure. We can produce a natural root structure, but it depends on what you bring to the party. If you are starting into a fertile pot with a seed or with a cutting or a clone, or even a plug, something that's coming out of a really good plug system that's been moved right on time, or an Elipot, or some of these other, Fratis and these kind of plug systems, it will perform very well. But if you bring to the party an overgrown plug that is wrapped up and in a containerized structure, I can't undo that with the fertile pot. So it's important that you start from the beginning and get your root structure right from the very beginning. As soon as you compromise that root structure with any kind of containerization, there is no system that's going to be able to undo that.
So the whole idea here is just minimizing transplant shock. We're trying to keep the plant as happy as possible, so we're not adding on any delays in terms of our overall plant cycle. And you mentioned some of these other containers or propagation methods. Can we touch on the differences between fertile pot and the pros and cons of like soil blocks, oasis cubes, peat pots, rapid rooters, some of these things that people are more familiar with?
Well, there's a lot of systems out there. I mean, it's absolutely amazing the ingenuity that people have had over the years in trying to produce propagation systems. Which particular one do you want to tackle?
Let's just start with an easy one. Soil blocks was one that I had never heard of until recently. One of my employees mentioned that on her tiny farm she uses these things that make little blocks of soil, so there actually isn't a container around her plant. I had an initial thought on that, but I'll go ahead and let you speak to it first.
It's kind of like if you were a kid and you had a little, you're building a sandcastle at the beach and you got a mold that's shaped like a brick, and you pack the sand in there and then you pull it out, that's essentially what you're doing. The problem with the soil block is that you're compressing the soil, you're reducing the air ratio in there. And the availability of oxygen is really the number one factor in determining whether or not roots are going to develop. So you've got to have a substrate that allows for good aeration in there. And when you compress something, you're limiting those air spaces and making it harder for roots to develop.
Yeah, that was my concern, was compaction.
Yeah, you don't see that. I mean, I see that in a lot of small organic operations, especially in the Northeast, but I have never, ever seen that in any serious commercial operation.
I wanted to talk to you about peat pots because I have used those in the past with clones and seedlings, and I've seen them in, Home Depot, for example. What's the big difference there between a fertile pot and a peat pot?
One of the ways you can tell the difference between a fertile pot and a peat pot is look at the bottom of the pot. If there's a drain hole cut into it, then it's a peat pot. If there's no drain holes cut into it, then it's a fertile pot. The reason that the peat pots are using the drain holes cut into them is because the wall of the pot is not porous enough to allow the air, the roots, and the water to pass easily through the pot. So they cut a drain hole into it. And of course, by extension, you can see that as the roots reach the edge of that pot, they're not going to pass through. They're going to turn inside. Now, as the pot breaks down, you will start to get roots passing through the sidewall of the pot. This is true. But if you go into the box stores and you look at some of the vegetable plants that are offered in peat pots, you'll see on the instructions it says to tear the bottom of the pot off before you plant it in the ground. And there's a simple reason for that, is because they want the roots to be in contact with the soil, and the pot is not going to break down on its own as easily in the ground. So with a fertile pot, we do not recommend tearing the bottom of the pot off. And as a matter of fact, we don't recommend doing anything except putting it into the soil or the next larger container.
Okay, and then what about Oasis cubes or rapid rooters? Those are two really common ones I see in the industry. One is sort of a synthetic or artificial medium.
Yeah.
And the other one uses, it looks like it's rubber based, so I assume glues. Can you touch on those real quick?
Well, the Oasis has got some advantages in that it's extremely consistent material. You're going to have a really high media to air ratio in there, but it's also completely devoid of any organic matter. So there is no cation exchange with Oasis. When you are growing with Oasis, it's a very technical product, and you can grow a good plant with that for sure. But you have to be very, very careful about making sure that your fertility is dead on and it's very, very consistent. So like I said, there's some advantages and disadvantages to everything. When you're using a fertile pot or when you're using any kind of organic media, you've got a good cation exchange. You're going to have the ability for that soil to hold and release nutrients to the plant as needed. So it's a little more forgiving than foam products. The rubber glue is another interesting, or the glue plugs, or the rubber dirt is another interesting product. It's media that's mixed with a glue and then poured into trays. You'll see it in things like Performa and I guess Rapid Rooter. I'm not exactly familiar with that one, but if it's a glue plug, it's the same kind of thing. And the benefit to those is that as the roots develop, they don't reach the edge of the cell that they're in yet. You can still pull the whole thing, and the plug will stay together because of the glue that's in there. I'm not sure if they're available in organic or not, but the idea with the fertile pot is that everything in there is organic. There is no glues, there's no binders that's in there.
Okay, and any comments on rock wool cubes?
Rock wool cubes, again, it's a mineral. I do not believe it's approved for use in organics at the moment, although I that seems to be changing all the time. So, check back with Omri on that. But relatively expensive compared to fertile pot with a media in there, and then impossible to get rid of at the end of the story because it doesn't break down, and you're going to have to throw it away in a landfill.
And then the last one I had on my list was AeroCloners. I see a lot of people using those and then going into soil. And for me, that challenge was always trying to be delicate to the roots and get them planted correctly without damaging the plant. And I always seem to get transplant shock when going from an AeroCloner into soil.
I'm sorry, I can't speak to that one. I didn't do my homework on what an AeroCloner was.
It's sort of a misting system, so the
okay.
roots are just sitting in air and then being continually misted underneath the level of the. You can picture like a giant Rubbermaid tote sort of thing with holes in the top, and then there's a aeroponic or misting system underneath that the roots are exposed to, so you can put a nutrient solution or some sort of cloning solution to that.
Sure. So that's going to be those are going to be water roots. That's relying exclusively on taking up the nutrients from the moisture there that's in the air. Making that transition to terrestrial roots is difficult sometimes. So that's why you're getting the transplant shock there if you're trying to go into a soil from there. You could probably continue to grow and go into hydroponic systems, and it would probably do well. But the transition between water roots to terrestrial roots is a difficult one. It's a little easier to go the other way from terrestrial to water roots, and that's why you'll see, like with the fertile pot, a lot of people will start with a very, very small plug, like a 72 cell that's one of our strips. They'll start them, they'll grow them, lettuce and other kind of herbs that they're growing hydroponically, and they'll take those and they'll transplant those plugs into floating rafts. And the roots will then continue to grow down through and into the nutrient solution tank underneath, and the water roots will develop from there. But it's a little more difficult to go the other way around.
Sure. And what sort of media are people using typically in your containers, or does it vary across the board?
It's all across the board, depending upon what they personally think is the best one for their crops. I mean, the majority of people are using soilless peat-light-based mixes. A lot of coir is now being incorporated. People are doing, mushroom composts. There's all sorts of different formulas that are out there, but you can put whatever formula you want into the pot. It doesn't, you're not restricted to one sort of substrate or another.
Now, I love encouraging people on this podcast to look outside of the cannabis industry for products, nutrients, information in general, and research. And so can you tell me a little more about some of the applications that you're seeing with these containers? Like you said, they've been around for a long time now with the grape industry.
Oh, yeah. Well, the grape industry has been, one of our biggest customers for a long time. We do just massive numbers in Europe. We do very large numbers in California, some in New York here. But it's the grape industry has been a reliable customer for us for a long time. One of the other industries that we do very, very well with is breeders, people who are experimenting and trying to grow the perfect crop, and they're seed companies. And so what they'll do is maybe they might be doing GMO stuff, but they'll buy 1 million pots. They'll plant up and they'll grow 1 million different seedlings, and then they select out of that 50 that they're going to carry on from there. The remaining leftovers they want to get rid of, and they don't want anybody to have that genetic information, so they compost it, and the composting process destroys, the heat of the composting process destroys all the genetic information, so there's nothing left over, and they don't have to remove and clean up 1 million pots at the end of the story. They just put them in the compost pile and turn them into windrows from there. But the majority of our customers are normal, nurseries and greenhouses that are propagating to grow on for something that's going to be a finished product later.
That's great. We can probably only talk about containers for so long as a topic.
Yeah.
But I will.
I can go on forever.
That's impressive. I mean, I can appreciate that. I will say that I was pleasantly surprised with the pricing associated with these containers, and I'm positive that between the reduction in transplant shock and the ability to have a larger window to transplant, and the labor savings of not having to remove the plant and transplant in a more traditional method is going to more than pay for themselves, regardless of your opinions on the ecological and environmental impact of traditional containers. So I'm really excited to incorporate these into our processes at our nursery and start working with more of these larger cultivation facilities, or even smaller medical or home grows that want to switch over. It's very, very affordable. We're talking pennies on a lot of these pots, so it's not.
Yeah. I mean, our customers, some of them are really environmentally conscious, and we check all the boxes there. It's a terrific product from an environmental standpoint of view, but the majority of our commercial customers are not necessarily environmentally conscious. They're conscious about pennies, and so that's where we also shine there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge proponent of organics, but I try not to push that too hard for people because it can be off-putting. So I love products or methods that just happen to be organic, but they make sense economically, to where even if you didn't care about the environment or your ecological impact, you're still going to want to use this product, or you're still going to want to use this methodology because
Right.
it's going to save you money and time and grow a better plant.
Exactly. One other thing I wanted to say was a lot of people, this is when people are asking me about how long does it take to break down in the soil. This is a question that I get a lot of times. And my smart aleck answer is it doesn't matter because the pot is porous and it's biodegradable. It's not stopping air, roots, or water from moving back and forth over that barrier. The longer answer is it really depends on the microbial action and where you are located. If you're in, Antarctica, it's going to probably take a long time to break down. It's like a book. You keep it dry, it'll last forever. If it's moist and wet, it's going to break down faster. So, like I said, the smart aleck answer is it doesn't matter because the plant is just there. It's as if the pot never existed. Realistically, for most people in North America, about a year or so, you won't be able to find any evidence of this pot.
So that does bring up a storage thing that you and I talked about off air, was that you do need to store these containers in a dry location,
Yeah.
so they're not getting in contact with moisture, which can cause the microbes to break them down faster. Mice and rats may potentially chew on them if you had them, say, just sitting outside in your greenhouse.
Yes. In my barn here, I have many, many boxes of fertile pots that are for samples. Some of them are many years old. Most of them I'm sending out enough samples that they're turning over. But it's like I said, it's like a book. If you keep it dry, like it is in the library, it'll stay for hundreds of years. As soon as you let them get wet, they'll break down. But we did have a problem when we first moved here and put the pots in the barn, that the mice were eating them. And the problem, I'm willing to share fertile pots with the mice. That's not a problem. However, they only want to eat right up the stack, and they take one little half moon out of the top of every pot as it goes up. So we got cats, and that solved our problem.
That's great. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit, because one of the things besides this product is you have another product that's more specific for gardeners and not so much cannabis. But I do feel that a lot of people that are growing cannabis are also interested in growing their own vegetables. And for me, as a vegetable gardener, I was really excited, and I can't wait to try this out. I've been reading about it online, and I know I have a sample coming in the mail today. I can't wait to check it out. Now, this product is for dealing with slugs.
Yes, it's called Slug Gone Wool Pellets. It's very cool. It comes out of the UK, and it's been it's been around for quite a while now. But realistically, as Slug Gone Wool Pellets, it's been on the market for about 10 years now. And what it is, it's pelletized waste wool that you put around a plant, and when it swells up and it felts together, it forms a barrier that slugs and snails don't want to cross over. And the neat thing about it is that it's a season-long barrier because it takes so long for it to break down that it'll stay efficacious for 8 to 14 months. The way that this works is you have a sheep, and when you shear the sheep, you get the raw fleece, which has all of the stuff that has the good fibers and the lanolin, but it also has a lot of sweat and poo and dirt and other things like that. And so when you take it to a scouring facility, they take all of the good fibers and the lanolin out, and then what's left over is called shoddy, which is basically what it sounds like, and it was a waste product. And so in order to get rid of it, what they would do is they would throw it onto the fields next to these scouring facilities where they were growing rhubarb, just to dispose of it. They would turn it in. And they began to notice that in these fields, they were not getting any slug or snail damage, where in the fields where they were not turning the slug gone or the shoddy into, they were getting some. So they began to figure out what's going on here is that slugs and snails have a mucus foot that is easily irritated by anything that's scratchy. The fibers of wool have little hooks and barbs in it that allow it to felt together to form a fabric. It also makes it scratchy. And so as the slug or snail tries to crawl over this wool product here, they find it irritating to their mucus foot, and they choose to go somewhere else. It doesn't kill them. It's not a pesticide. It's not a poison. It's a barrier that prevents them from reaching the plant that you want to protect. It also acts as a moisture wick. It's acting as a wick that's pulling the moisture out of the slug's foot. They don't like that either. They don't like to be scratched, and they don't like to be dry. But there's some other benefits to it besides the fact that it's going to keep a plant protected for 8 to 14 months from slugs and snails. It's also a moisture mulch because as you put this down, the pellets swell up to about 3 times their size. They lock together. They form this mat that the water can penetrate through. Rain will penetrate down through, but it doesn't evaporate out from underneath, so it keeps the soil a little moisture around the plant there. When it does rain, or when you have high winds or whatever, it's not going to blow away. It acts very much the same way diatomaceous earth does in terms of forming a barrier, but it doesn't wash away. It doesn't blow away. You don't need to reapply after every single rain like you do with a lot of the iron sulfate products. It's also a weed barrier. I mean, I'm going to be like the Ginsu knife guy here for a second, but wait, there's more. It's a weed barrier because it sets up this mat that the seeds can't come up through. The weeds don't want to come up through, and seeds that land on top of it, because remember, it's wicking the moisture away from the surface. The surface is very dry, so seeds that land on top are less likely to be able to volunteer because there's not a lot of available moisture on the surface of this plant. It's also but wait, there's more. There's also, it's a thermal barrier because wool has thermal properties. So during the summer, it will keep the soil a little cooler around that plant. It'll also keep the soil a little warmer on the shoulder seasons underneath, so you can extend your growing season to some extent. And then at the end of the story, basically it's organic matter that's just biodegrading and adding organic matter to your soil to increase the health of your soil.
So are we getting any nutrition or nutrients out of this?
Well, this is where I get into a little bit of a pickle here. In the label in the UK, the label says contains slow release nutrients, because it is organic matter, so there is technically some fertility to it. However, in the United States, if you claim any kind of fertility, you are a fertilizer, and you have to get DEP registration in every single state that you want to sell your product in. And this was just not feasible for us. So the easier thing in the U.S. label, it does not say anything about nutrition on there because nobody's going to buy this as a fertilizer. It's just not really effective as a fertilizer. So the easier thing was to say for the U.S., we're not going to make any claims whatsoever about fertility, at least in writing.
Okay, but we can apply fertilizer over the top of it that would solubilize and water down through it.
You can apply fertilizer over top of it that will solubilize and will go through, correct. However, if you're using slow release materials, it might act as a bit of a barrier there. You're definitely going to have enough water to flush it down through there.
Okay, and one thing I wanted to talk about was prior to learning about this product, there were sort of 4 options that I had for organic gardeners that were dealing with slugs. And the first one was Sluggo, which I believe is iron phosphate. It's made by a large corporation. I can't remember if it's Dow or Monsanto, one of those large ag companies, which I try not to support when I can help it. But that's what I was using, and I didn't love the idea of adding an iron phosphate based product to my soils consistently over time, but it does help control slugs. In addition to that, the next option would have been like beer traps or things like that.
Yep.
They're messy. They're a lot of work to set up and maintain. Plus, I would rather drink the beer than give it to my slugs.
Sure.
The other option was going out there at night with your clippers and just manually chopping them up as you see them. You're not going to get every one, but you can help keep them under control that way. And then the last option was another barrier option, which was copper tape.
Yeah.
But one thing you talked about was not all slugs that we see are actually above ground.
Right. The slugs do go underground. And this is one of the reasons that the Slug Gone wool pellets cannot be used. You can't just take a barrier and put it all the way around your garden, 10 feet by 10 feet, let's say, because the slugs will go under it. So what you need to do with the Slug Gone is you need to put a 4-inch wide barrier around the base of each plant so that as they try to come up, they're going to encounter the Slug Gone in there. It's a barrier product. It can't be used on a per square foot basis. But I want to touch briefly on what you're talking about with, all of these other methods are basically killing the slugs. And slugs, love them or hate them, they are part of the ecosystem. And when you remove any link in the chain in an ecosystem, you're creating a less than desirable situation. Birds eat them, lizards and frogs eat them. They do eat, depending on the slugs, they do eat some of your pests out there. But it's something that what we choose to do is say, let's decide the plants you can't have. And you can go somewhere else and be part of the ecosystem, but just don't eat this plant here, please.
I really like that. I love that way of looking at it. I mean, slugs are a big issue here in Washington State with the weather that we have.
Sure.
We have a ton of slugs, and there's nothing more frustrating than growing a spinach plant and putting all this time into it only to come out the next day and have it just be munched.
Well, it's no coincidence that the weather in the UK is similar to the weather in Northwest Washington.
So one other thing about this slug gone is that we didn't touch on yet is that it does have an odor.
So remember, I was saying that the shoddy is basically everything that's left over after you take out the long fibers, the short fibers, the lanolin, etc. And so you're going to have a pelletized product that smells a bit like a barn. You can actually smell it if you put your nose right up to the bag. You can kind of smell it through there. First time that we were deciding to see whether we wanted to work with this, we took a tray, we put it in our laundry room, and we put some Slug Gone in there, and I poured some water over it, and I wanted to see what happened. We went out to dinner. We came back and opened up my house, and I'm like, what is that stink? It smells like a barn in here. And it was the Slug Gone. Obviously, it's not meant as an interior product. However, when you put the Slug Gone around your plant material outside, as it dries up, within about a day or so, any of that odor is gone. Some people love the smell of the barn. Some people hate the smell of the barn. But it is a fact of life that the Slug Gone will have a slight odor to it when it's first applied. But within 1 to 2 days at the most, I challenge you to be able to smell anything, even if you put your nose right up to it.
I'm really excited to try this out in some of my raised beds next season because I always hate battling slugs, and I usually just take them and chuck them into the woods across my property. But I love knowing that I can safely protect my plants and not have to be so vigilant all the time and worry about losing my favorite vegetables. So.
Right, and again, remember, this is something you'll put down in the springtime. As soon as you've determined where your plants are going to be, you put the Slug on around them, and then you walk away. You don't have to do anything after that. It's going to swell up on its own. You need a band about 4 inches wide or so around the plant so that the slugs can't cross over it. But it doesn't need to be thick. It doesn't need to be mounded up. 1 pellet layer high is enough. And if you want to try to do this as judiciously as possible, you can spread your pellets around, let them swell up, and then you can come back and see where are my holes. You can't have any holes, you can't have any gaps, because slugs will find their way through those gaps to your plant. So you can come back, you just drop a couple little pellets on top of the holes. They will then in turn swell up and naturally felt on their own together. You don't have to do anything but put it down and let it swell on its own. And it's going to stay in place there for the entire season. You're not coming back every time it rains. This is a one-time application per season.
That's great. And it brings up one last question for me. Since you happen to be married to one of the foremost entomologists in the country, what are the effects of this product in terms of beneficial insects or other insects?
No negative effects. No negative effects. I mean, remember, it's like putting a wool sweater around your plant. There's not any positive or negative effect there.
So it's really just slugs and snails.
It's slugs and snails. Any other pest will crawl right over it. I mean, it's not stopping anything other than something that has a mucus foot, something that can be irritated. I mean, imagine rubbing a piece of sandpaper on your eyeball. That's what it feels like to a slug trying to cross over this stuff.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Sorry for that imagery.
Well, I think that's all of my questions for today. I hope that listeners will find this useful, and if they want, I will definitely put all of your contact information out there. We will have the Slug Gone and the fertile pots available on our website as well. I'm really excited to start working with you on some of these products.
Thank you, Ted. Appreciate the time.
That was William Evans, the North American distributor of Fertile Pots and Slug Gone. You can view links to these products as well as William's website on the podcast page. I hope this podcast will help people in considering better ways to propagate their plants as well as more sustainable solutions to plastic pots, at least in the smaller sizes. We've switched over our entire farm this year, and now we'll be educating our community on why our veggie starts are in these containers instead of plastic pots that they have to put into a landfill, plus the big benefit of reducing transplant shock. You are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. Don't forget that there's more information and articles available on our website and blog at www.kisorganics.com, as well as links to the data and information we discussed in this episode on the podcast page. And if you enjoy these podcasts, please take a moment to leave me a review on iTunes and send me your feedback and suggestions through our website contact page or tad@kisorganics.com. Thanks for listening.